we begin a journey into the darkest, most gilded corridors of royal palaces. We will walk through halls where love letters were treated as weapons, where a single tear could be an act of rebellion, and where one wrong curtsy could cost you everything. What if I told you that for centuries, the greatest threat to a royal bride was an assassin lurking in the shadows or poison in her wineglass? They feared something far more intimate and terrifying. They feared their mothers-in-law. These weren't your typical difficult in-laws complaining about holiday dinner plans. These were empresses, queens, and dowagers who held the power to exile you to a foreign country with a single letter, who could turn your own children against you with a whisper, literally erase you from the history books. We are diving deep into the most brutal family power struggles ever recorded, exploring the moments when royal brides dare to disobey and face consequences that would make modern family drama look like a gentle tea party. Before we unlock these palace secrets together, I would love for you to become part of our royal court here on this channel. If these stories of intrigue, survival, and rebellion captivate you as much as they do me, a simple like and subscribe would mean the world. But only when you genuinely feel that spark of curiosity I'm hoping to ignite. I'm curious, too. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you in a cozy bedroom, a quiet study, or perhaps traveling somewhere new? Drop a comment below and let me know what brought you to this moment with me. I read everyone in love, knowing where our community gathers. Now dim those lights. Let the gentle hum of your fan or the quiet of the evening create that perfect atmosphere. And let's step into a world where love, power, and survival collided in the most dramatic ways imaginable. The Gilded Cage. You are 20 years old, maybe even younger. You have just married into the most powerful family in your known world. Your wedding was a global spectacle, a lavish affair witnessed by thousands, or in later centuries by millions. Your dress cost more than entire villages would see in a lifetime. After the ceremony and the celebrations, the quiet reality sets in. You're supposed to smile, curtsy gracefully, and disappear into a life that someone else has completely and meticulously planned for you. But here's the fundamental truth about power. It's never really about the crown on your head. It's about who controls the hand that places it there. We have romanticized royal marriages as the stuff of fairy tales. True love's kiss, the promise of happily ever after. But the reality for most was far grimmer. Royal marriages were business mergers written in blood, strategic alliances sealed with political promises, and enforced by the most formidable women you could ever imagine. These were not women who would simply suggest you change your hairstyle or offer unsolicited criticism of your cooking. These were empresses, queens, and dowagers who clawed their way to power through decades of treacherous court intrigue. They had survived their own brutal initiations into royalty, and they saw every new bride who married their son as either a valuable asset to be controlled or a dangerous threat. Let me paint you a clearer picture of what real power looked like in their hands. In the rigid hierarchy of medieval or Renaissance courts, a mother-in-law could control whether you ate that day and with whom. She decided if the letters you wrote to your family ever reached home, or the replies you received were the original, unaltered versions. She could dictate whether your children would be allowed to know your native language, or even if you would be permitted to practice your own religion in the privacy of your chambers. With a network of spies and loyalists in every court in Europe, she could spread rumors that would ruin your reputation internationally, ensuring you would never find sanctuary anywhere. And if you proved to be let's just say that many royal brides throughout history met mysteriously tragic and premature ends after defying their new matriarchs. But here is what makes these stories absolutely fascinating. Some brides refused a break. They found ways to fight back that were so subtle, so psychologically brilliant, that we are still talking about their rebellion centuries later. Denied overt power, they learned to turn the tools of femininity into weapons of war. They turned fashion into a battlefield, transformed their personal religious devotion into a political statement, and used the sacred act of motherhood itself as their ultimate weapon. These young women were playing a high-stakes game of chess where the rules were written by their opponents, where every move was scrutinized, and where one mistake could mean not just their own destruction, but the downfall of their family and even their entire kingdom. Some of them not only survived this gilded cage, they revolutionized a very system that tried to crush them. The mother-in-law relationship in royal families was unlike anything we see today. It was not just personal, it was dynastical. Every choice a royal bride made, from a friend she kept to charity she supported, reflected on her mother-in-law's legacy, on her ability to control her household, and on her reputation across Europe's vast and interconnected web of royal families. A disobedient daughter-in-law was not just a family embarrassment. She was a crack in the foundation of centuries of carefully built political alliances. And the methods these royal matriarchs used to maintain control were masterpieces of psychological manipulation. Public humiliation was disguised as instruction in court tradition. Private conversations felt less like family chats and more like interrogations. Gift-giving came with invisible strings attached, creating debts of loyalty that could be called. They could make you feel grateful for their cruelty and apologetic for your own existence. But what is truly remarkable is how some of these young brides, often teenagers isolated in a foreign land, learned to navigate this treacherous landscape. They discovered that in a world where direct confrontation meant certain death or exile, indirect rebellion could change history. They learned to speak in code, to find allies in the most unexpected places, a sympathetic servant, a disgruntled courtier, and to turn their very femininity into a form of armor. Some used beauty as their form of rebellion, refusing to conform to their mother-in-law's stated aesthetic preferences, knowing that their appearance would be a topic of discussion in every court across Europe, sending a message of their independence. Others used motherhood, strategically timing their pregnancies to coincide with political negotiations, understanding that their ability to produce heirs, especially male heirs, was their greatest and sometimes only source of leverage. The most brilliant among them learned to play the long game. They smiled through years of humiliation, quietly observing, learning the intricate workings of the court, and building networks of personal loyalty that would serve them when they became the mothers-in-law themselves. They understood that in the world of royal power, patience was not weakness. What strikes me most about these stories is how modern they feel. If you strip away the crowns and the castles, you will find timeless truths about power, control, and the complex, often fraught dynamics between women and families. These weren't just historical figures and portraits. They were real people dealing with the kind of family politics that would challenge anyone. As we are about to discover, the price of disobedience varied dramatically depending on the era and the particular personality of the mother-in-law in question. Some brides faced exile, others faced death, and a brave few managed to turn the tables entirely, seizing power for themselves. But one thing remained constant. The moment a royal bride decided to assert her own will, she was entering a battle that would define not just her own fate, but the destiny of generations to come. The stories we are about to explore together will take us from the glittering, gossiping courts of Versailles to the shadowy, silent harems of the Ottoman Empire, from medieval England to modern-day Japan. We will meet women whose names have been whispered in both admiration and terror for centuries, and we will discover how their choices, their sacrifices, and their rebellions continue to influence royal families even today. So settle in, because our first stop takes us to one of the most famous and public royal rebellions in modern history. It's the story of a young woman who refused to be silenced, who chose compassion over protocol, ultimately changed a monarchy forever. We will dive into how Diana Spencer's very public defiance of Queen Elizabeth II didn't just break the royal rules. It broke the royal system itself, creating ripples that the House of Windsor is still feeling today. Diana's revolution, the War of the Waleses, stepping into perhaps the most watched royal rebellion of our lifetime. On August 31st, 1997, the world woke up to shocking news that would forever change how we view the British monarchy. The story of defiance didn't begin with that tragic night in Paris. It began nearly 2 decades earlier with shy, 19-year-old kindergarten teacher who had no idea she was about to challenge the most traditional and unmovable institution on earth. Picture Diana Spencer, barely out of her teens, thrust into a fishbowl existence where her every breath was monitored, her every smile analyzed, and her every tear dissected by the global media. But here is what most people don't realize. The real battle wasn't the paparazzi or the press. Grinding battle was happening behind closed palace doors, in quiet, private conversations that would make your most uncomfortable family dinner look like a joyous celebration. Queen Elizabeth II was not just Diana's mother-in-law. She was a living embodiment of a 1,000-year-old institution, a system that had survived wars, revolutions, and countless challenges to its authority by adhering to one core principle, duty above all else. And suddenly, here was this young woman who seemed determined to rewrite every single rule. The first signs of trouble appeared almost immediately after the fairy tale wedding, a ceremony watched by an estimated 750 million people globally. While the world was still enchanted, the Queen was already noticing things that deeply concerned her. Diana's natural, unforced warmth, the very quality that made her instantly beloved by the public, was exactly what worried the palace the most. The British royal family had spent centuries perfecting what we might call strategic emotional distance. They waved, they smiled, they performed their duties with impeccable precision, but they never, ever let the public see them as fully, messily human. Their power was derived from their mystique. Diana shattered that mystique. She hugged children with AIDS at a time when the medical establishment was still debating whether it was safe to even shake their hands. She sat on the hospital beds of sick patients, held the hands of the dying, and, most shocking of all to the establishment, she cried in public. The Queen's private secretary once famously described Diana's approach as emotional incontinence. That single phrase tells you everything you need to know about how the institution viewed genuine human feeling. Can you imagine being professionally criticized for showing too much compassion? But that was Diana's daily reality. According to many palace insiders, came what they called a touching issue. It was as natural as breathing, of reaching out and physically comforting people. She would touch a shoulder during conversation, hold a hand for reassurance, or stroke the cheek of a distressed child. For the Queen, who had been trained from birth to maintain a proper, respectful distance, watching Diana literally embrace the public was like watching someone break every sacred rule of the monarchy. But here is where it gets truly fascinating. The Queen's attempt to control Diana weren't just about dusty protocol. They were about institutional survival. Elizabeth had witnessed the abdication crisis of her uncle, King Edward VIII. She had seen firsthand how quickly public opinion could turn against the monarchy. In her mind, Diana's emotional transparency was dangerous because it made the royal family too relatable, too human, and therefore too vulnerable. The palace tried everything to rein her in. They assigned Diana official handlers to monitor her public appearances. They provided her with detailed briefings on appropriate behavior and conversation topics. They even had courtiers follow her with tissues, apparently concerned that public tears would damage the monarchy's carefully preserved dignity. But Diana kept breaking through every barrier they constructed. One particularly telling incident occurred during a 1987 visit to a children's hospital. Diana had been specifically instructed by her aides to maintain an appropriate distance during the photo opportunity. She ended up sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by children battling serious illnesses, playing with toys and laughing alongside them. The resulting photograph showed a member of the royal family being genuinely, spontaneously joyful in a way the public had never seen before. It was an iconic image of empathy. The Queen's response was swift and calculated. Diana received what courtiers euphemistically called guidance, essentially a formal reprimand from the highest level about the importance of maintaining royal dignity. But here's the brilliant part. Diana understood that her greatest strength was also her greatest weapon. The more the palace tried to suppress her natural warmth, the more the public fell in love with her authenticity. She began what we might call strategic vulnerability. Her bombshell 1995 Panorama interview, "There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded," was not just Diana sharing her pain. It was Diana weaponizing her pain against an institution that had tried to silence her. She knew that every tear she shed in public chipped away at the Queen's carefully constructed image of royal perfection and stoicism. The numbers tell the story. In the wake of Diana's death, public support for the monarchy dropped to its lowest point in modern history. Polls showed that a quarter of Britons wanted to abolish the monarchy entirely, and a staggering 65% believed the royal family was out of touch with ordinary people. Diana's rebellion had fundamentally and permanently changed how the public viewed their royal family. But what's truly remarkable is how the Queen, a master of survival, ultimately responded. Rather than doubling down on tradition, she began to slowly, carefully, and strategically modernize. She started paying taxes on her private income. She opened Buckingham Palace to public tours. She even allowed cameras inside the palace for documentaries, giving the public a glimpse of the human side of the monarchy. In many ways, Diana's defiance forced the institution to become more relatable, more human, and ultimately more sustainable for the modern world. Even Diana's fashion choices became acts of rebellion. When the Queen suggested more conservative, traditional clothing, Diana responded with a now famous revenge dress, the stunning, off-the-shoulder black number she wore on the very same night Prince Charles publicly admitted his affair on television. Every outfit became a statement. Every public appearance became a carefully choreographed message to both the palace and the public. The tragedy is that Diana's rebellion ultimately cost her access to the very children she was trying to protect. But her influence on her sons, William and Harry, is undeniable. You can see Diana's warmth, her willingness to break protocol, and her commitment to emotional honesty in the way they have chosen to live their own royal lives. Perhaps most importantly, Diana proved that even the most powerful and ancient of institutions could be changed by a single person who was willing to consistently choose authenticity over approval. She showed that rebellion doesn't always require grand gestures or political coups. Sometimes it's as simple as refusing to stop caring, refusing to stop feeling, and refusing to stop being human in a system designed to suppress humanity itself. In her later years, the Queen seemed to develop a grudging respect for what Diana had accomplished. She began to incorporate some of Diana's approaches: more personal interactions with the public, greater emotional accessibility, and modernized communication strategies. Diana achieved what she couldn't quite accomplish in life. She forced the monarchy to evolve. But Diana's story is just the beginning of our journey tonight. Her modern rebellion was revolutionary, but it was not unprecedented. Long before Diana challenged British royal protocol, another young woman was facing an even more formidable opponent, an empress who had literally conquered nations and was not about to let a foreign bride threaten her hard-won legacy. We will travel back to 18th century Russia, where Catherine the Great's daughter-in-law dared outshine the most powerful woman in the world, the Empress and the Ingenue. Now imagine, if you will, stepping into the glittering, frost-covered world of 18th century Russia. This was a world where winter palaces stretched for miles, where court servants numbered in the thousands, and where one woman's word could literally reshape the map of Europe. This is a story of what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object, when Maria Fyodorovna, a spirited and beautiful German princess, collided with Catherine the Great, the most formidable empress in Russian history. In October 1776, while America was busy declaring its independence across the ocean, a 26-year-old princess named Sophia Dorothea of Württemberg was arriving in St. Petersburg. Upon her conversion to Russian Orthodoxy, she took the name Maria Fyodorovna, completely unaware that she was about to enter the most dangerous and psychologically complex chess game of her life. Maria was not just marrying Paul, the difficult and neurotic heir to the Russian throne. She was entering the orbit of and challenging a woman who had seized power through a military coup, who had expanded Russia's territory by over 200,000 square miles, and who had absolutely no intention of sharing the spotlight with anyone, least of all her son's pretty new wife. And she truly was great in the most terrifyingly effective way possible, had spent 16 years consolidating her power. She had overthrown her own husband, survived multiple assassination attempts, and ruthlessly crushed rebellions that would have toppled weaker rulers. At 47, she was at the absolute peak of her influence, commanding the intellectual respect of Voltaire and the military respect of Frederick the Great. And then in walks this young German princess, who apparently did not get the memo about who really ran Russia. A subtle but significant one happened before Maria even reached the palace. Catherine had spent weeks planning the perfect welcome ceremony, a carefully choreographed display of Russian imperial power designed to overwhelm and intimidate the new arrival. Picture thousands of soldiers in perfect formation, the nobility in their finest court dress, and a grand procession that stretched for miles through Moscow's snow-covered streets. With an innate sense of theater, stepped out her carriage wearing a stunning creation from Paris. It was the absolute latest in French fashion, a gown so elegant and modern that it made every Russian court dress look positively medieval by comparison. The crowd's reaction was immediate and electric. Here was a level of sophistication they had never seen before, an elegance that made their own empress's more traditional style seem almost provincial. Watching from her palace window, felt something she hadn't experienced in years, unsettling grip of being upstage in her own empire. What happened next was pure psychological warfare, masterfully disguised as hospitality. Catherine began hosting what she called intimate family dinners. Intimate meant only about 50 of Russia's most influential and gossipy courtiers. These were not social gatherings. They were public performance evaluations where every word Maria spoke was analyzed, every gesture scrutinized, and every response measured against Catherine's impossible standards. The dress wars began almost immediately. Catherine had always prided herself on her appearance. She understood that in a world where female power was a rarity, looking powerful was essential. But Maria brought assets that Catherine could no longer compete with: natural beauty and an innate sense of style that made high fashion look effortless rather than calculated. Court records from the period reveal Catherine's growing paranoia about her daughter-in-law's rising influence. She began what historians now call the documentation project. She had trusted servants record Maria's daily activities in minute detail. noting every conversation, every visitor, and every letter sent or received. Catherine was building a case, collecting evidence of, well, nobody was quite sure what crime Maria was supposedly committing, but Catherine was determined to find one. The breaking point came during the Easter celebrations of 1777. It was a hallowed tradition for the Empress to lead the religious processions, to be the living center of Orthodox ceremony and Russian spiritual life. But when Maria appeared in her specially designed Russian court dress, a brilliant fusion of German elegance and Russian tradition, something extraordinary happened. The people lining the streets of St. Petersburg began cheering for her instead of for Catherine. Catherine's face in that moment. This was a woman who had fought wars to earn respect, who had corresponded with the greatest minds of the Enlightenment to prove her intellectual worth, and who had spent decades meticulously crafting her image as Russia's great modernizer. And here was this young woman earning the adulation of Catherine's own people simply by being gracious and beautiful. Catherine's retaliation was swift and brutal. She began what court historians euphemistically call educational guidance sessions, private, hours-long meetings where Maria was subjected to a relentless barrage of criticism about everything from her posture to her pronunciation of Russian words to the way she held her fork. Former court ladies who served during this period described these sessions as psychological torture disguised as motherly concern. But here is where Maria proved she was far more than just a pretty face. Instead of crumbling under Catherine's immense pressure, she began to study. She learned the Russian language with an intensity that impressed even her harshest critics. She memorized Orthodox prayers. She devoured books on Russian history. And most brilliantly, she began writing letters to Catherine that were masterpieces of diplomatic language. Preserved in the Russian state archives, reveal Maria's genius strategy. She never once directly challenged Catherine's authority. She consistently positioned herself as Catherine's devoted and humble student, constantly asking for guidance while subtly demonstrating her own intelligence and growing political awareness. She was essentially killing Catherine with kindness, while quietly building her own network of support within the court. Their conflict reached its climax after the birth of Maria's first child, Alexander, in 1777. Following Russian imperial tradition, took control of the infant immediately after birth. She removed him from his parents and raised him herself in her own wing of the palace. This was the ultimate power move, designed to demonstrate unequivocally who controlled the imperial succession. But Maria's response was brilliant. She didn't fight for the baby directly. She knew that was a battle she would lose. She began learning everything she could about child rearing from traditional Russian peasant women, absorbing folk wisdom and positioning herself as more authentically Russian than the German-born empress who had stolen her child. What ultimately saved Maria was her understanding of the long game. She realized that Catherine, despite her immense power, was mortal. Maria was in her 20s. Catherine was nearing 50. Time was on Maria's side. If she could just survive immediate danger. She began what we might call strategic patience, building relationships, learning essential political skills, and quietly waiting for her moment. The most remarkable aspect of this entire conflict was how it ultimately strengthened both women. Faced with genuine competition for the first time in years, was forced to modernize her approach to imperial power and public image. Tested under the most extreme pressure imaginable, developed the political and diplomatic skills that would serve her throughout her long and influential life. Their story reveals something profound about power, survival, and the complex, often competitive, dynamics between women in positions of authority. But Maria's survival strategy in Catherine's court was just one approach to deal with an impossible mother-in-law. The stakes were even higher, and the conflicts even more personal. We will journey to another royal court where a young princess faced not just political pressure, but the weight of an entire nation's expectations and her own mother's horrified disappointment, communicated from across international borders, and the mother of all micromanagers. Let's transport ourselves now to the most glittering, most decadent, and ultimately most doomed court in all Europe, 18th century Versailles. A 14-year-old Austrian princess was about to become the most hated woman in France. But here is the twist that history books often miss. Marie Antoinette's real, day-to-day enemy was not the revolutionary mob that would eventually call for her head. Her most formidable and relentless opponent was sitting in a palace 400 miles away in Vienna, writing letters that would make any modern helicopter parent look positively hands-off. Meet Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, a woman who had given birth to 16 children, while simultaneously running the Holy Roman Empire, fighting wars against Frederick the Great, and revolutionizing European diplomacy. She was, quite literally, the most powerful woman in the world, and she was absolutely mortified by her youngest daughter's behavior in France. The letters between Maria Theresa and her daughter, Marie Antoinette, preserved in the Austrian state archives, read like the most intense mother-daughter drama you could possibly imagine. Except the stakes were not just family harmony. They were the stability of two major European powers and, ultimately, the lives of millions of people. Every month, sometimes every week, detailed reports about Marie Antoinette's activities were traveling from Versailles to Vienna. And I mean detailed. What she ate, how much money she gambled away, who she spoke to at court, how long she spent on her toilette, and even how many times she appeared in public without a proper smile. Maria Theresa had created what was essentially an 18th century surveillance network focused entirely on her daughter's every move. The criticism started almost immediately after Marie Antoinette's arrival in France in 1770. One of Maria Theresa's first letters, written just months after the wedding, contains this absolutely brutal line. "I hear that you're getting up at 10 or 11 o'clock. This is deplorable, and you will lose the respect of your household and of the public." Can you imagine your mother, from another country, somehow knowing exactly what time you're waking up and sending official letters of complaint about it? But Maria Theresa was not just being a controlling parent. She understood something that Marie Antoinette, in her youthful naivete, that royal behavior was never private, that every action was a political statement, and that her daughter's reputation could literally start or end wars. The gambling letters are particularly fascinating. Maria Theresa discovered, through her spies, that Marie Antoinette was spending her evenings playing cards for money. We're talking about sums that would be equivalent to hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's currency. Her letter about this is a masterpiece of maternal fury, disguised as political strategy. "I cannot hide from you that it grieves me to heart to see you neglect your essential duties for the sake of card parties which lower you in the eyes of the world." But here's what makes this relationship so complex and tragic. Maria Theresa wasn't wrong. Every single criticism she leveled at her daughter would eventually contribute to the French people's growing hatred of their queen. The late mornings made her seem lazy. The gambling made her appear frivolous. The extravagant clothes made her look disconnected from the struggles of ordinary people. Maria Theresa could see the revolution coming 20 years before it happened, and she was desperately, frantically trying to save her daughter from herself. The most heartbreaking letters deal with Marie Antoinette's struggle to produce an heir. For 7 long years after her marriage, she failed to become pregnant, a situation that put enormous pressure on the fragile political alliance between Austria and France. Maria Theresa's letters during this period reveal a fascinating and painful mixture of genuine maternal concern and cold political calculation. "I am worried about your health, my dear daughter, but I am even more concerned about the implications for the monarchy." Think about receiving that from your mother. Being told that your deeply personal struggles are not just about your happiness, but about international diplomacy and the fate of empires. The pressure Marie Antoinette faced would have broken most people. What Maria Theresa failed to fully grasp was that her daughter was fighting her own battles at Versailles. The French court was incredibly insular and hostile to foreign influence. Marie Antoinette's Austrian origins made her an automatic suspect, the eternal outsider. Her attempt to create her own social circle and her fashion choices were not just acts of frivolity. They were desperate attempts to modernize a rigid, suffocating system and create her own space within an oppressive environment. The tragedy is that Maria Theresa died in 1780, 9 years before the French Revolution reached its bloody peak. She never lived to see her worst fears realized, never witnessed her daughter's trial and execution. But her letters are prophetic. They predict almost everything that would happen: the growing resentment of the French people, the financial crisis that would trigger the revolution, and the way Marie Antoinette's personal choices would be twisted and used against her politically. Their story illuminates something crucial about family dynamics under extreme pressure, how love and politics can become impossibly intertwined, can become a form of suffocating control, and how physical distance can make relationships both more precious and more painful. All royal mother-daughter-in-law conflicts ended in such public tragedy. The daughter-in-law won decisively, using weapons that were far more subtle and ultimately more devastating than anything Marie Antoinette ever attempted. We will discover how one medieval queen turned the tables completely, using her oppressor's own system against her in ways that would reshape the future of England itself. Eleanor of Aquitaine, the queen who perfected revenge. Welcome to what might be the most epic revenge story in medieval history, one that makes Game of Thrones look like a gentle family dispute. This is a tale of Eleanor of Aquitaine, a woman who personally controlled more territory than the King of France, who had been the queen of two different powerful countries, and who decided that her son's choice of mistress was an offense worth destroying kingdoms over. Let me paint you a picture of just how powerful Eleanor was. By the 1170s, she was arguably the most influential woman in the Western world. She owned the vast and wealthy Duchy of Aquitaine in her own right, had survived one of the most dramatic royal divorces, and had given birth to future kings of England. At nearly 50 years old, she was still politically active, still capable of commanding armies, and absolutely not the kind of woman you wanted as an enemy. Enter Rosamund Clifford, a young, beautiful English noblewoman who had captured the heart of Eleanor's husband, King Henry II of England. Royal mistresses were not unusual in medieval times. What was unusual was how completely Henry seemed to lose his mind over this particular woman. We are talking about a king who had conquered Ireland and who controlled an empire stretching from the borders of Scotland to the Pyrenees Mountains, completely abandoning political strategy for what chroniclers of the time delicately called excessive devotion. Eleanor watched this unfold with the cold, pragmatic calculation of someone who has spent decades navigating the brutal world of royal politics. She understood that Henry's infatuation wasn't just personally humiliating, it was politically dangerous. When a king becomes predictable, when his priorities become personal rather than political, his enemies start plotting. And Eleanor had far too many enemies to allow her husband to become vulnerable. The breaking point came when Henry began publicly acknowledging Rosamund in ways that threatened the legitimacy and inheritance of Eleanor's own sons. Medieval succession was always a precarious business, but Henry's obvious preference for his mistress over his queen was creating exactly the kind of succession crisis that could plunge England into a bloody civil war. What happened next depends on which historical source you trust, as the story has been embellished by centuries of legend. But all versions agree on one thing. Eleanor decided that Rosamund Clifford had to be eliminated. The question was how to do it without creating a political crisis that would destroy her husband's reign and her own son's inheritance. The most famous legend involves a maze at Woodstock Palace. According to the chronicler Ranulph Higden, Henry had constructed an elaborate labyrinth to protect Rosamund's private chambers, with only one secret path known to the king himself. With the cunning of a master strategist, supposedly discovered this path by finding and following a single silken thread that had caught on Henry's spur and led directly to his mistress's door. Whether or not you believe the maze story, and it does sound a bit too much like a fairy tale, what we know for certain is that Eleanor gained access to Rosamund through a combination of bribery, espionage, and political pressure that would make modern intelligence agencies envious. The most widely recorded version of Rosamund's death involves Eleanor confronting her in her chamber and presenting her with two choices, a bowl of poison or a dagger. The symbolism here is critically important. She was forcing Rosamund to choose her own method of destruction, making her complicit in her own demise. It was a masterclass in psychological dominance. Rosamund chose the poison. She died at Godstow Abbey in 1176, with her death officially recorded as being from natural causes. But every chronicler of the period and every court in Europe understood exactly what had happened. Eleanor had successfully eliminated her rival while maintaining perfect plausible deniability, a masterstroke of medieval political assassination. Henry's reaction was swift and devastating. He immediately had Eleanor imprisoned. This was not just house arrest. It was actual imprisonment that would last for 16 long years. But here's the brilliant part of Eleanor's plan. She had anticipated this. Before making her move against Rosamund, she had already set in motion a series of political alliances and had begun to cultivate dissent among her own sons, ensuring her eventual return to power. While locked away, Eleanor orchestrated one of the most successful long-term political campaigns in medieval history. She maintained a secret correspondence with her sons, Richard, the Lionheart, and Geoffrey, gradually turning them against their father. She cultivated relationships with European nobles who resented Henry's power. Most importantly, she brilliantly positioned herself as a victim of Henry's irrational rage. Catherine's face in that moment. This was a woman who had fought wars to earn respect, who had corresponded with the greatest minds of the Enlightenment to prove her intellectual worth, and who had spent decades meticulously crafting her image as Russia's great modernizer. And here was this young woman earning the adulation of Catherine's own people simply by being gracious and beautiful. Catherine's retaliation was swift and brutal. She began what court historians euphemistically call educational guidance sessions, private, hours-long meetings where Maria was subjected to a relentless barrage of criticism about everything from her posture to her pronunciation of Russian words to the way she held her fork. Former court ladies who served during this period described these sessions as psychological torture disguised as motherly concern. But here is where Maria proved she was far more than just a pretty face. Instead of crumbling under Catherine's immense pressure, she began to study. She learned the Russian language with an intensity that impressed even her harshest critics. She memorized Orthodox prayers, she devoured books on Russian history, and most brilliantly, she began writing letters to Catherine that were masterpieces of diplomatic language. Preserved in the Russian state archives, reveal Maria's genius strategy. She never once directly challenged Catherine's authority. She consistently positioned herself as Catherine's devoted and humble student, constantly asking for guidance while subtly demonstrating her own intelligence and growing political awareness. She was essentially killing Catherine with kindness, while quietly building her own network of support within the court. Their conflict reached its climax after the birth of Maria's first child, Alexander, in 1777. Following Russian imperial tradition, took control of the infant immediately after birth. She removed him from his parents and raised him herself in her own wing of the palace. This was the ultimate power move, designed to demonstrate unequivocally who controlled the imperial succession. But Maria's response was brilliant. She didn't fight for the baby directly. She knew that was a battle she would lose. She began learning everything she could about child rearing from traditional Russian peasant women, absorbing folk wisdom and positioning herself as more authentically Russian than the German-born empress who had stolen her child. What ultimately saved Maria was her understanding of the long game. She realized that Catherine, despite her immense power, was mortal. Maria was in her 20s. Catherine was nearing 50. Time was on Maria's side, if she could just survive immediate danger. She began what we might call strategic patience, building relationships, learning essential political skills, and quietly waiting for her moment. The most remarkable aspect of this entire conflict was how it ultimately strengthened both women. Faced with genuine competition for the first time in years, was forced to modernize her approach to imperial power and public image. Tested under the most extreme pressure imaginable, developed the political and diplomatic skills that would serve her throughout her long and influential life. Their story reveals something profound about power, survival, and the complex, often competitive, dynamics between women in positions of authority. But Maria's survival strategy in Catherine's court was just one approach to deal with an impossible mother-in-law. The stakes were even higher, and the conflicts even more personal. We will journey to another royal court where a young princess faced not just political pressure, but the weight of an entire nation's expectations and her own mother's horrified disappointment, communicated from across international borders, and the mother of all micromanagers. Let's transport ourselves now to the most glittering, most decadent, and ultimately most doomed court in all Europe, 18th century Versailles. A 14-year-old Austrian princess was about to become the most hated woman in France. But here is the twist that history books often miss. Marie Antoinette's real, day-to-day enemy was not the revolutionary mob that would eventually call for her head. Her most formidable and relentless opponent was sitting in a palace 400 miles away in Vienna, writing letters that would make any modern helicopter parent look positively hands-off. Meet Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, a woman who had given birth to 16 children, while simultaneously running the Holy Roman Empire, fighting wars against Frederick the Great, and revolutionizing European diplomacy. She was, quite literally, the most powerful woman in the world, and she was absolutely mortified by her youngest daughter's behavior in France. The letters between Maria Theresa and her daughter, Marie Antoinette, preserved in the Austrian state archives, read like the most intense mother-daughter drama you could possibly imagine. Except the stakes were not just family harmony. They were the stability of two major European powers and, ultimately, the lives of millions of people. Every month, sometimes every week, detailed reports about Marie Antoinette's activities were traveling from Versailles to Vienna. And I mean detailed. What she ate, how much money she gambled away, who she spoke to at court, how long she spent on her toilette, and even how many times she appeared in public without a proper smile. Maria Theresa had created what was essentially an 18th century surveillance network focused entirely on her daughter's every move. The criticism started almost immediately after Marie Antoinette's arrival in France in 1770. One of Maria Theresa's first letters, written just months after the wedding, contains this absolutely brutal line. I hear that you're getting up at 10 or 11 o'clock. This is deplorable, and you will lose the respect of your household. Can you imagine your mother from another country somehow knowing exactly what time you're waking up and sending official letters of complaint about it? But Maria Theresa was not just being a controlling parent. She understood something that Marie Antoinette, in her youthful naivete, that royal behavior was never private, that every action was a political statement, and that her daughter's reputation could literally start or end wars. The gambling letters are particularly fascinating. Maria Theresa discovered, through her spies, that Marie Antoinette was spending her evenings playing cards for money. We're talking about sums that would be equivalent to hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's currency. Her letter about this is a masterpiece of maternal fury, disguised as political strategy. I cannot hide from you that it grieves me to heart to see you neglect your essential duties for the sake of card parties which lower you in the eyes of the world. But here's what makes this relationship so complex and tragic. Maria Theresa wasn't wrong. Every single criticism she leveled at her daughter would eventually contribute to the French people's growing hatred of their queen. The late mornings made her seem lazy. The gambling made her appear frivolous. The extravagant clothes made her look disconnected from the struggles of ordinary people. Maria Theresa could see the revolution coming 20 years before it happened, and she was desperately, frantically trying to save her. She brought with her what the French nobles considered exotic and dangerous knowledge, the art of Renaissance poisoning, political manipulation refined to a science, and a network of spies that would make modern intelligence agencies envious. By the time she became the Queen Mother of France in 1559, she had transformed herself from a neglected foreign bride into the most feared woman in Europe. But here is where Catherine's story becomes truly fascinating. She did not start as a villain. For the first 25 years of her marriage to King Henry II, she was essentially powerless, constantly overshadowed by her husband's powerful and beautiful mistress, Diane de Poitiers. Catherine spent those decades watching, learning, and planning. When Henry died in a gruesome jousting accident in 1559, she was finally ready to unleash everything she had absorbed about power, survival, and, when necessary, elimination. The first daughter-in-law to face Catherine's wrath was Elizabeth of Austria, who married Catherine's son, King Charles IX. Elizabeth was everything Catherine was not, devoutly Catholic, and most dangerously, genuinely beloved by the French people. The chronicler Pierre de Lestour wrote that Elizabeth's wedding procession through Paris drew larger and more enthusiastic crowds than any royal event in living memory. Catherine's approach to dealing with Elizabeth was a masterclass in psychological warfare disguised as maternal guidance. She insisted that Elizabeth's food be prepared only by specific cooks who happened to be trained in Catherine's personal, private kitchen. She arranged for Elizabeth's chambers to be cleaned with special aromatic oils that, according to Venetian ambassador reports, contained mysterious and exotic ingredients imported from Italy. The most chilling aspect of Catherine's method was her use of what Renaissance courts called beauty treatments. Elizabeth began receiving regular applications of cosmetics, perfumes, and skin treatments that Catherine personally supervised. According to surviving recipes found in Catherine's private paper, contained substances like mercury, lead, and arsenic, poisons that would slowly and imperceptibly accumulate in the body over time. Elizabeth of Austria died in 1574, officially from complications in childbirth. But the symptoms described by her court physicians, severe abdominal pain, hair loss, tremors, and confusion, perfectly matched the signs of chronic heavy metal poisoning. The timing of her death was particularly convenient for Catherine, as Elizabeth had been growing increasingly influential with the king, potentially threatening Catherine's absolute control over her son. What made Catherine's method so effective was their terrifying subtlety. Unlike the dramatic instant poisonings we see in movies, Renaissance assassination was often a slow, creeping process designed to mimic the symptoms of natural illness. Catherine had access to the most sophisticated chemical knowledge of her era. The evidence for Catherine's involvement is not just circumstantial. In 1574, French authorities discovered what they called Catherine's laboratory in a secret, hidden room of the Louvre Palace. The space contained hundreds of vials, complex distillation equipment, and detailed notes about the effects of various toxic substances. Among the documents were what appeared to be clinical observations of young women, including precise descriptions of their symptoms and their progression over time. But Catherine's most ingenious weapon was her use of plausible deniability. She positioned herself as a loving, concerned mother-in-law who was devastated by these tragic losses. She organized the most elaborate funeral ceremonies. She commissioned memorial artworks. and she publicly mourned her daughters-in-law's deaths with theatrical grief that convinced even the most skeptical observers. The psychological impact on her surviving sons was devastating and, from Catherine's perspective, strategically perfect. They became completely dependent on her guidance, terrified of making decisions without her approval. Contemporary accounts describe Catherine's court as a place where young women approached marriage to her sons with the same enthusiasm they might show for their own execution. The Spanish ambassador wrote, "The Queen Mother's reputation precedes her daughters-in-law like a plague. They arrive already pale with fear, and their complexions rarely improve." What's particularly chilling is how Catherine created an entire system around these eliminations. She established what she called the Women's Network, a group of ladies-in-waiting, physicians, and servants who were completely loyal to her. These women would monitor the new daughters-in-law, reporting everything from their political conversations to their physical symptoms. Catherine's methods were so effective that they became a template for political elimination across Europe. The Italian method, slow poisoning disguised as medical care, spread to other courts, often implemented by women who had trained in Catherine's household. But even Catherine de' Medici's Renaissance reign of terror was just one approach to controlling problematic royal brides. Sometimes the challenge was not eliminating foreign influences, but managing the collision between different cultural expectations of what royal women should be. We will discover how a Hollywood star learned that marrying a prince meant entering a world where even Grace Kelly's legendary charm couldn't smooth over some very old-fashioned European attitudes about American wives. Grace Kelly and the Monégasque matriarch. From the dark, treacherous corridors of Renaissance France, we leap forward to the glamorous, sun-drenched 1950s, where Technicolor movies were redefining beauty and an Oscar-winning actress was about to discover that real-life fairy tales come with some very demanding and traditional in-laws. On April 19, 1956, America's sweetheart and the reigning queen of Hollywood married Prince Rainier III of Monaco in what was billed as the wedding of the century. But behind the fairy tale facade, a cultural war was brewing between American Hollywood glamour and old-world European tradition, a war personified by Grace and her new mother-in-law. Grace Kelly was not just any American bride entering European royalty. She was the epitome of American success, an Academy Award winner, a box office sensation, and a woman who had literally redefined what it meant to be a movie star, wealthy in her own right, and accustomed to being the most important person in any room. And then she met Princess Charlotte of Monaco, a woman who had some very different and very firm ideas about what a princess should be. Princess Charlotte represented everything that old European aristocracy valued: discretion over publicity, duty over personal ambition, and most importantly, the unwavering belief that a woman's primary role was to enhance her husband's status. She had spent her entire life in the rarefied world of European nobility, where every gesture was coded, every conversation was strategic, and American directness was considered somewhere between amusing and appalling. The first clash happened before Grace even arrived in Monaco, over the wedding itself. Princess Charlotte had envisioned a traditional ceremony steeped in centuries of Grimaldi family tradition, one that would emphasize Monaco's ancient dignity and its deep European. Grace, meanwhile, influenced by Hollywood's understanding of spectacle and her American sense of celebration, had her own ideas. The dress negotiations alone could have triggered an international incident. Princess Charlotte wanted Grace to wear the traditional Grimaldi. Grace took one look at the heavy, elaborate gown and diplomatically suggested some minor modifications that would essentially transform it into something completely different. The guest list became another battlefield. Princess Charlotte wanted a carefully curated list of European noble families. Grace wanted her Hollywood friends and her American family, a celebration that would feel warm and inclusive rather than formally intimidating. But the real conflict was deeper than wedding planning. It was about fundamentally different ideas of what a royal woman should be. Princess Charlotte believed a princess's role was to be a dignified symbol, present but not prominent. Grace Kelly had built her entire career on being front and center, on commanding attention and wielding influence. The issue of Grace's MGM contract revealed just how different their worlds were. Grace initially planned to continue her acting career. Princess Charlotte was horrified. Royal women did not have careers. The idea of a Princess of Monaco appearing in movies, taking direction from common film producers, was absolutely unthinkable. Contemporary interviews with palace staff revealed the daily, grinding tensions that developed between the two women. Grace would arrive for breakfast wearing casual American clothing, slacks, simple blouses. Princess Charlotte would appear in full formal dress, wearing the kind of elaborate jewelry that signaled her royal status. They looked like representatives from different centuries, sitting at the same breakfast table. Language became another source of friction. Grace spoke fluent French, but it was an American accented French that marked her as a foreigner to sensitive European ears. Princess Charlotte would gently but persistently correct Grace's pronunciation. Each correction was a subtle reminder that Grace did not quite belong. The most serious conflict developed around Grace's approach to motherhood. When Grace became pregnant, she wanted the kind of active, hands-on parenting style that was becoming popular in America. Princess Charlotte expected the royal children to be raised by a team of nannies, tutors, and staff, with the parents maintaining a more formal. Grace's insistence on personally caring for her children, changing diapers, feeding them herself, playing with them in public, struck Princess Charlotte as both undignified and potentially dangerous to the children's royal upbringing. But Grace had learned something important during her Hollywood career: how to maintain her essential self while adapting to different roles. She began what we might call strategic compliance, following Princess Charlotte's guidance on public matters while maintaining her own values in her private life. The transformation was gradual but remarkable. Grace learned to move with the kind of measured grace that European royalty demanded. She mastered the art of being simultaneously warm and distant, accessible and mysterious. She developed what fashion historians now call the Grace Kelly style, a timeless fusion of American accessibility and European sophistication that influenced royal fashion for decades. Princess Charlotte began to appreciate some aspects of Grace's American approach. Grace's genuine interest in the people of Monaco, her willingness to engage with social causes, and her natural ability to connect with the press actually strengthened the monarchy's public image in ways that traditional royal behavior never could have. Their relationship evolved into what court observers called a respectful coexistence. Grace's legacy in Monaco demonstrates that successful cultural adaptation does not require complete assimilation. She proved that royal families could evolve and modernize while maintaining their essential character. But even Grace Kelly's diplomatic success could not prepare us for some of the more intense royal family conflicts that were to come. The cultural differences were so profound, and the expectations so incompatible, that no amount of goodwill, Masako and the Chrysanthemum Throne, the Rebellion of Silence. Fast forward now to modern Japan, a nation where ancient traditions collide with 21st century expectations, and where the most powerful form of rebellion is not dramatic speeches or public confrontations. This is the story of Masako Owada, a Harvard-educated career diplomat who married into the world's oldest continuous monarchy, only to discover that her greatest act of defiance would be simply refusing to speak. When Masako Owada married Crown Prince Naruhito in 1993, she was not just any accomplished woman entering royal life. She was a polyglot who spoke 6 languages fluently, a rising star in the Japanese foreign ministry, who had negotiated international trade agreements, and a woman who had turned down the prince's marriage proposal twice before finally accepting. She represented everything that modern Japanese women aspire to become: educated, independent, and internationally sophisticated. But the Japanese imperial family operates by rules that make European royal protocol look positively casual. This is an institution that has existed for over 1,500 years, where every gesture is prescribed by centuries of tradition, and where the very concept of individual expression is considered not just inappropriate, but potentially dangerous to the social order. Enter Empress Michiko, Masako's mother-in-law, who had navigated these treacherous waters for over 3 decades. Michiko was not unsympathetic to Masako's challenges. She herself had been the first commoner to marry into the imperial family and had faced her own struggles. But by 1993, she had become the ultimate guardian of imperial tradition, a woman who understood that the monarchy's survival depended on absolute adherence to established protocols. The first signs of trouble appeared almost immediately. Masako's natural inclination to engage in substantive, intelligent conversations during official events clashed with the imperial expectation that royal women should be beautiful, silent, decorative presences who spoke only when directly addressed. Foreign diplomats reported being deeply impressed by Masako's intelligence and expertise. But these same qualities that made her effective internationally made her a problem domestically. The immense pressure to produce a male heir created a particularly brutal dynamic. In the Japanese imperial system, only males can inherit the Chrysanthemum Throne. This meant that Masako's primary value to the institution was her ability to give birth to a son. For a woman who had built her entire identity around her intellectual achievements, being reduced to a purely reproductive function was psychologically devastating. But here is where the story becomes truly fascinating. Masako's response to this impossible situation was to develop what the Japanese media euphemistically called an adjustment disorder, but what was, in effect, a form of strategic withdrawal from public life. She began missing official events, canceling public appearances, and essentially disappearing from the role she was expected to play. And conservative body that governs a family responded with a campaign of what appeared to be concerned support, but was actually a sophisticated form of psychological pressure. They issued medical bulletins explaining the crown princess's condition, but these bulletins subtly reinforced a narrative that she was failing in her duties rather than responding rationally to an impossible situation. What made Masako's rebellion particularly effective was its profound subtlety. She never openly criticized the imperial system. She never gave interviews expressing her dissatisfaction. Instead, she simply became increasingly unavailable, creating a vacuum that forced everyone else to confront the deep, systemic problems with the institution. When Masako finally became empress in 2019, her approach to the role reflected everything she had learned during her years of struggle. She maintained the dignity required by tradition, while subtly introducing more personal and accessible elements to her public interactions. She proved that royal women could adapt to their roles without completely sacrificing their individual identities. Her story reveals important truths about the power dynamics in modern royal families. Sometimes, the most effective rebellion is not dramatic action, but strategic inaction. Sometimes, the most powerful weapon is not words, but silence. And sometimes, the most successful resistance is not fighting the system, but simply refusing to participate in it. A legacy of rebellion. After traveling through centuries of royal rebellion, from medieval poison chambers to modern Instagram feeds, we arrive at the most important question of all. What can these extraordinary stories teach us about survival, power, and the eternal human struggle between duty and desire? The patterns that emerge from these tales reveal timeless truths about family dynamics that extend far beyond palace walls. The royal brides who succeeded were not necessarily the most beautiful or the most intelligent. They were the most adaptable. They were the ones who understood that survival in impossible circumstances requires a combination of patience, strategic thinking, and the ability to adapt without losing one's essential self. Maria Fyodorovna survived Catherine the Great's court by becoming strategically valuable while appearing non-threatening. Grace Kelly succeeded by finding a way to modernize royal traditions without destroying them. Masako of Japan used strategic withdrawal to force institutional change. Each woman found a different method, but they all understood the same fundamental principle. Direct confrontation with institutional power rarely works, but persistent, intelligent pressure can reshape even the most rigid systems. The technology of rebellion has evolved dramatically. Eleanor of Aquitaine used poison and political assassination. Queen Victoria employed continental correspondence networks. Meghan Markle weaponized social media and global broadcasting. Underneath these different methods, the core strategy remains the same: control the narrative, build public support, and force institutional change through external pressure. What is most inspiring about these stories is how they demonstrate that change is always possible, even in the most oppressive circumstances. The British monarchy today is fundamentally different because of Diana's rebellion. The Japanese imperial system evolved in response to Masako's struggles. Change happens slowly, often at great personal cost, but it happens. The survival guide that emerges from these stories is not just relevant to royal families. The strategies these women used, building networks of support, maintaining strategic patience, controlling available narratives, are applicable to anyone dealing with difficult family dynamics or oppressive institutional situations. Technology may change, but the fundamental human dynamics remain constant. People in positions of power will always try to control those who threaten their authority. And individuals trapped in oppressive situations will always look for ways to assert their autonomy. I hope these stories have given you new perspectives on the power dynamics you may see in the world around you. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of when royal brides dare to disobey and face their mothers-in-law's wrath. These stories of courage, survival, and transformation remind us that even in the most impossible circumstances, the human spirit finds a way to assert itself and create change. Until our next journey together into the fascinating corridors of history, remember that sometimes the most important rebellions begin with the simple, quiet decision to remain true to yourself no matter the cost. Sweet dreams, and may your own family dynamics be far more peaceful than the royal courts we have visited tonight.